Ladies and gentlemen, over the last week, it would appear that we have seen ActionSA join the Progressive Caucus. But before we get on to the main news story, if I can, yet again, remind you, if you haven't already subscribed to this channel, please do, it really does help us. And if you'd really like to support the work I do here, you're welcome to buy me a coffee. The link is in the description box below. So on to the first news story. Hlophe has been barred from participating on the JSC interviews. The DA, some NGOs, and Corruption Watch brought an action against Hlophe to stop him from participating in the interviews. Hlophe being the first judge in the South African history to be removed from office for corruption. Now, for those of you who don't know what the JSC does, it effectively interviews potential judges and provides disciplinary action against judges for potential misconduct, something that Hlophe himself was subjected to. The argument really is that Hlophe, having been disbarred as a judge and kicked off the high courts for forms of corruption, means that he shouldn't be allowed to discipline potential judges, well, on the basis that he's not exactly a sound character to do that. The High Court in the Western Cape actually granted the relief, and I quote, "It's the independence, impartiality, dignity, accessibility, and effectiveness of the JSC. It's to protect all of that. So they're removing him." According to the judges, there was a misunderstanding by the National Assembly that they couldn't stop the nomination of MK of Hlophe. However, MK describes the entire debacle as being irrational and nothing more than a lynching of Hlophe, to which they also said that they would be appealing the judgment. They regarded it as a degree of judicial overreach and as a form of disregarding the Constitution. Now, COSATU, strangely, actually supported the move and called it logical and sensical. I must say I found that rather unusual. ActionSA, however, is where it becomes really interesting, because ActionSA claims that the actual judgment highlights a constitutional blind spot. ActionSA asks the question, if you're fit to work on the National Assembly and you're fit to be the official opposition and your party nominates you for the JSC, how are you not eligible for that role? Now, on the basis of the facts, this is actually a sound argument. If he is eligible to work for Parliament, and the rules state that Parliament can nominate these individuals, why is he not fit to serve on that role? Now, I get the whole argument of, well, he was the first person to get chucked out of office for corruption. Yes, he did some wrongs in office, and it might impact the impartiality of the bench. But then we have to ask the logical question, and it's a question that we've been asking for a very long time. Why are politicians serving on the interview panel on the JSC in the first place? This isn't a question of eligibility. Politicians shouldn't be on the JSC. It undermines the independence of the JSC. We've seen this in numerous times. We've seen it with Julius Malema, specifically with regards to David Unterholter, who was disregarded for office because he one time found a judgment against the EFF. See how this works? So my argument would be, politicians shouldn't be involved in the bench full stop. Forget Hlophe. However, let's get on to what's really more important. The actual case was brought by the DA. And so one could argue that potentially the only reason that ActionSA finds against it was because it was a DA victory. And ActionSA at the moment isn't a fan of the DA for logical reasons. But Herman Mashaba himself is actually becoming a very interesting character. Let us use 4 tweets as an example. The first is a call by Gareth Cliff of the residents of Swanne to actually boycott tax. Now, for those of you who don't know what the dispute in Swanne was over, was basically over the raising of municipal salaries. The raising of municipal salaries was a huge dispute because the city claimed, specifically underneath Brink, that they couldn't afford it, basically. Now, according to ActionSA, they wanted to pay the pay rises, and there's really where the argument came in. So if you heard the argument of we're not paying workers, well, that's basically what it is. It's around pay rises. Now, the argument being that in many instances, the services in Swanne are not fit for purpose anyway, and so you're paying over the odds for services that don't work. However, the tweet from Herman Mashaba on this calls the entire call to have a tax boycott irresponsible, but then goes on to say, maybe those who were forced into slavery and built South Africa, maybe they should ask for reparations. What Herman Mashaba is talking about, I don't know. Last time I checked, we didn't have cotton farms, but who knows? It's a new world. Everybody claims slavery of something or other. However, in another tweet, he then goes on to basically say that the reason for kicking people out of Swanne was he heard that the DA was going to work with the ANC and that potentially he was going to get ousted as deputy mayor and ActionSA would be excluded from the executive. And so he says the DA were going to stab him in his back. And so basically, he stabbed the DA in the back before the DA could stab him in the back. So it's revenge. That's not a good look. We also then seen lots of references to, this is 2024 and not 1948, reference to apartheid. So what's with the constant referencing to 1948? And this has happened in numerous tweets now. We then have references to, we know our history. Yeah, everybody knows their history in South Africa, but we know what history you're trying to refer to, Herman. And that's the exploitation of black individuals, which means that you're basically race grifting. And so I've got to ask you the question, is Herman Mashaba now the new Julius Malema? Should he just merge ActionSA with the EFF? And this save us all a lot of trouble. Because the way that I see it at the moment, I have to ask you the logical question. Is Herman Mashaba an EFF plant sent to destroy the DA? And you may ask yourself, well, why would I say that? Well, it would appear that Herman Mashaba, while still with the DA, basically was more than willing to work with the EFF in Joburg. And that collapsed. We all know about that time of collapse. We also then seen ActionSA wanting to work in numerous other instances with the EFF around the country, which always leads in collapse. And all these collapses ultimately all make ActionSA suffer because the voters inevitably turn on the party itself. So why would you do that? Why would you damage your party in order to just favor the EFF constantly? Now, you're also supposedly ActionSA being a free market, non-racial party. The EFF aren't that. If Julius Malema says he's a black nationalist, we all go, okay then. But Herman Mashaba claims not to be this. He claims to want to build a united society, but then gives a very narrative that isn't very united. That's ultimately where the issue becomes. So moving on to the issue of Brink himself anyway. According to the DA, they want Brink reinstated as mayor of Swanne. The DA have said, if this doesn't happen, then all the talks to stabilize all the other municipalities around the country will cease to happen, and they will suspend those talks. Now, according to the DA, the Gauteng leadership actually ignored the national leadership when kicking Brink out of office. And the rationality for this is that Hlophe rules Gauteng, and he basically just did what he wanted to do anyway. Now, Hlophe isn't actually a fan of the DA, nor of the GNU. And we've seen numerous instances where Hlophe has basically been trying to instigate trouble with the GNU, for want of a better word. We saw it when he encouraged Ramaphosa to sign the Bella Bill, knowing full well that the DA didn't support that. We've now seen it in that Hlophe ignored calls from National Executive to actually do some kind of deal around Brink, and he was just like, nah, we'll be fine. So this has led people to argue that Hlophe is attempting to cause a form of damage with the GNU. But now, Hlophe and his office are arguing that the DA are trying to do the reverse to him. They argue that the DA is trying to cause a rift between the provincial executive and the national executive of the ANC, specifically in line with the dispute. Now, more interestingly enough, they do argue that if you think about it logically, there shouldn't really be a dispute between the national and the provincial executive anyway. The DA in the Western Cape frequently sidelines the ANC, and no one says that this is actually undermining the GNU. And that's very true. If you look at it from an external point of view, one could argue that from a provincial point of view, you can do what you want. National executive is very different from provincial, and we are seeing that in the Western Cape. There is no room for the ANC in the DA's Western Cape. But then one has to ask the question, why should there be room for the DA in the ANC's Gauteng? You see, the argument works both ways, and it's not a stupid argument. But you know what is stupid? Well, ActionSA says they are going to nominate their deputy mayor to become the mayor of Swanne. So one would then argue, if you were being really cynical, that the only reason that ActionSA kicked Brink out in the first place was for nothing more than position hustling, because that's the way it seems. But whatever your views on this might be, the DA and the ANC say that at a national level, there's no hostility between the two parties. The GNU works just fine. This is a provincial dispute, and therefore that's where it will be limited to. According to John Steenhuisen, him and the president get on just fine, and there's no reason to panic. But in any case, you can let me know what you think in the comment section below. Anyway, that's it from me for now. You can let me know whether you think Herman Mashaba is a EFF plant, and whether Herman Mashaba should really just get on with it and join the Progressive Caucus. Because let's face it, he's sounding more and more like MK and EFF every day. But that's just my views. Until next time, bye.
May Allah guide you. That's so nice of you. Thank you. Buddha is the way. Really? I'm going to have to check that out later. I appreciate that, for real. Jesus.
Whoa, dude, that's so offensive.
Wow.
Really, dude?
Stop.
Wow.
Forcing your religion.
Wow.
Forcing
I don't
your
believe
religion.
in that Sky Daddy.